Thanks very much. I think that's a wonderful slide, and it sort of brings in the start of my talk. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the custodians of the land we stand on, the Gubbi Gubbi and the Jindabarra, their elders past, present, and emerging. Well, I've been monitoring the sandbanks along the Palmerston Passage from Bulcock Beach to Bells Creek for the Queensland Wader Study Group since 1992. I do the survey monthly at low tide to monitor the numbers of migratory and other water birds feeding on the sandbanks. Over the years, I have seen many changes in the sandbanks themselves and in the visiting bird population. Unfortunately, there has been a definite decline in the number of migratory birds arriving from the Northern Hemisphere. Now, why are the sandplants of the Palmerston Passage important? We've already been told that, I think, this morning. Because they form part of the vast coast stretches of Australia, which host the thousands of migratory birds each year, coming from the Northern Hemisphere for rest areas and relaxation in the Southern Hemisphere. These birds are the beneficiaries of several international agreements that have already been mentioned this morning, and they preserve the important wetlands for migratory birds, the passage being one such wetland as part of the Moreton Bay Ramsar site. The birds experience an endless summer as they breed and rear in their young in the Northern Hemisphere and come down here from places such as Siberia, Alaska, and Japan, and come here for the warmth of our summer. They arrive late August and September and leave again in mid-March and early April, making a round trip of some 26,000 kilometres. To arrive on the east coast of Australia, they fly a defined route known as the East Australasian Flyway along the shores of Korea, China, and Japan. The birds need what are known as staging posts, sand or mudflat areas on the intertidal estuaries along the route where they can rest and feed to gather the energy for the next leg of their journey. Unfortunately, many of these areas have been reclaimed for industrial purposes, residential development, or extended seaports, leaving very few areas for the birds to rest and relax. Large numbers of those areas that have been reclaimed are in the Yellow Sea, located between China and South Korea. And as Professor Fuller and his research team have discovered, they come from the University of Queensland, they discovered, there is a definite link between the loss of these staging posts and the decline in populations of migratory birds. This makes that region the epicenter of the species decline. To add to the decline, in some of the countries they pass through, the smaller birds are also shot or hunted for food. But by the time they arrive in the passage, they are exhausted and need quiet time to recuperate, recover their strength and build up their energy for the long flight home. But even here, they don't have the opportunity to rest and relax. They are still likely to be disturbed by people, off-leash dogs, kite surfers, windsurfers or sailboarders, and to a lesser extent, jet skis. There is also the problem of pollution, as we mentioned a bit earlier on, runoff from agriculture, siltation, heavy metals, excess nutrients, pesticides. Every time the birds are disturbed, they have to take off and fly around, and they use up some of this precious energy they need to fly back to their home grounds. As they can only feed at low tide, when the sandbanks are uncovered, that limits their feeding even more. But if you're wondering why these birds can feed in close flocks all together, it's because their bills are different length, and they have different lengths, different probes, so they can go down in different levels of the substrate and find different prey. These birds must increase their body weight by up to 70% in order to build sufficient energy and reserves to enable them to fly the long distance back to their breeding grounds. So while they're here, they have to actually increase their body weight by 70%. A Far Eastern curlew, for example, undergoes an absolute feeding frenzy, building up its fat reserves, and just before its migration, it shuts down the organs it doesn't need for the flight, thus saving a few precious grams of weight. Well, my patch of the Palmerston Passage is not as important, resting areas, as areas south in the passage like Turble Point, which usually hosts thousands of birds. It is nevertheless a link in the chain of conservation areas. Like all the other areas, it is losing its numbers of migratory birds. When I first started monitoring, I used to see hundreds of different species, but including the Far Eastern curlew, as I've mentioned, the curlew sandpiper, bar-tailed godwit, as well as pteric sandpipers, greater sand plovers, other waders, and large flocks of migratory and resident terns. I understand that in the late 80s, there were flocks of around 20,000 terns roosting on the sandbanks. But now, I'm lucky to see 20 Far Eastern curlew, 17 bar-tailed godwit. There are no greater sand plovers, no curlew sandpipers or pteric sandpipers, fewer other waders, and only small flocks of terns. The sandbanks were once covered by hundreds of feeding birds. Now they're great expanses of completely bare sand, nothing on them except the crabs. I have picked out the, the Far Eastern curlew, the curlew sandpiper, the bar-tailed godwit, and the greater sand plover as examples of birds in the threatened species list. The curlew sandpiper and the bar-tailed godwit are listed as near threatened in the Red Book of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN. The Far Eastern curlew is listed as endangered under IUCN, and both it and the curlew sandpiper are critically endangered under the Federal Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act 1999, EPBC. The greater sand plover is listed as vulnerable under EPBC. The populations of the curlew sandpiper and the Far Eastern curlew have declined by up to 80% since the 1980s, and there are now only 25,000 Far Eastern curlew left worldwide. 25,000. It is not totally gloom and gloom. There are still plenty of birds to watch, if you want to watch them, including other migratory species and the locals, such as pelicans, though they disappear to Lake Eyre when it rains. There are cormorants, egrets, black swans, Australian white ibis, little red-capped plovers, the magnificent white-breasted sea eagle, and the occasional glimpse of the black-necked stork or jabiru. But back to threats. The main one is, of course, climate change. Average temperatures in the Arctic have already risen at almost twice the rate of the rest of the world and may detrimentally affect species which nest in the open tundra, such as the curlew sandpiper. It is estimated that there could well be losses of 41 to 70% of such breeding habitat by the end of the 21st century. This is an appalling prediction. The realization in the not too near future that many more species could simply disappear because of inaction on global warming, and it is a sad indictment of our failure to take climate change seriously. The sandbanks of the Pumice-Stone Passage would be far poorer without its visitation of migratory birds each summer. Thank you.